Let's talk about some of the simplest pivot table tools: selecting, clearing, moving, and copying pivots. So you can find these options in the Analyze tab under your pivot table tools. You can clear, select, and move. So starting with your clear options, you have two choices here. Clear all essentially wipes your pivot table clean. So any fields that you would drag to filters, rows, columns, or values will be completely removed. You won't be deleting any data. In fact, you won't even be deleting the link to your data. You're simply returning to a blank canvas as if you had just inserted a brand new pivot. On the other hand, clear filters will only affect fields with filters in place. So by clearing filters, any field that's filtered will be reset to show all values so that your entire pivot table will end up being automatically unfiltered. Next up, you've got select options. Now, if you're using certain table layouts, you can select individual components of your pivot, either just the values, just the labels, all of the labels and values. Honestly, I don't find those options very helpful or useful, but what I do find helpful is the option to select the entire pivot table. And that will select any cell associated with the pivot table, and once you have it selected, you can then copy and paste to create duplicate versions of your pivot table in other locations in your worksheet or your workbook. And then last but not least, you have your move options. These allow you to simply take an existing pivot table and move it from place to place, either into a brand new worksheet or into a new cell or location within the existing worksheet. So let's actually practice this. So back in Excel, let's take a look at our pivot tab, and why don't we go ahead and apply some filters here. So let's look at only movies in French that were produced in France that are color. So we've got 3 filters, each drilling down to a particular filtered value. Now in my pivot table tools, I can drill into my Analyze tab, and here in the Actions pane, you'll see those clear, select, and move options that we talked about. So why don't we start with clearing the filters. So keep an eye on rows 1 through 3. When I clear the filters, all of those go back to showing all values, and now my entire pivot is unfiltered. Keep in mind that if I had added filters to my row labels as well, which we'll practice doing later in the course, those would be cleared as well. So now if I go back into clear, and this time clear all, you'll see that I've just wiped everything clean. So all of my fields that I had dragged into filters, columns, rows, and values are now back here in the field list. So the link to my data is still there. In fact, if I press Ctrl Z, you can see they're back into their original places. And essentially all that's doing is it's automating the process of clicking and dragging these fields out back into the field list. So now let's jump back into Tools and take a look at our select options. So in this case, these first 3 options are actually grayed out because I'm using a compact table. We're going to talk a whole lot more about table layouts in the rest of the course, but for now let's just talk about selecting the entire pivot table. So when I do that, any cell that's associated with the pivot is highlighted. So my filter rows, my row labels, my values, everything, even my grand total row. So from here I can press Ctrl C to copy it. So let's say I want to just basically replicate this pivot and put a second instance of it right here in cell E2. I can press Ctrl V and paste it here, and now I have 2 instances of my pivot table. And as you can see, it's copied the style, the format, the layout, everything. And what's great about this is that even though both of my pivots are tied to the same data source, they operate independently. So I can say, okay, let's see all the Australian movies here on the right and Canadian movies here on the left. And as you can see, they operate independently, which is great. But now what if I decide, okay, I actually want 1 pivot table per sheet? I can go ahead and select that second pivot, go back into Tools, and here's where I'd use the Move option. So let's just move it. I don't want to create a copy of it. I just want to actually take this 1 pivot and just move it somewhere else. And let's put it into a new worksheet. When I do that, you can see that Excel basically just created a new worksheet and dropped it right there. If I return back to my pivot sheet, that second instance is gone, and I'm just left with the first one here. And now, side note, one thing you might have noticed is that when I have a cell selected that's outside of the pivot table range, my field list disappears and my pivot table tools ribbon goes away as well. All you need to do is just select any cell that's associated with your pivot table, and you'll see that field list pop up again, as well as the pivot table tools ribbon. And if you don't see the field list, you can right click and it'll show up as a show field list here at the bottom. So you can hide it that way and then show it that way again. So there you go. Basic pivot table analyze tools, clearing, selecting, and moving pivot tables.